Hello, my name is Andy Hammermeister and I'm the Director of the Organic Agriculture Centre of Canada at Dalhousie University. And this is part 3 of a 3-part series on experiencing your soil for farming success. And this part will talk about soil biological properties and soil fertility. So we've gone through this slide a couple of times in the previous videos, but I just wanted to touch back on it, that we're talking about basic soil properties that are originating from the original parent material and soil forming processes. We talked a little bit about how we might manage those fundamental soil properties in the last slide deck. And now we're going to be talking a little bit more about how we might manage the biological properties and soil organic matter and soil fertility components of the soil, so we have that optimization of soil health and function, ultimately producing healthy crops with good resiliency and many services to the environment. And ultimately, lastly, we are trying to achieve greater sustainability in our production system. So let's take a look at the Cornell Soil Health Assessment Program, the Cornell framework, which I've been referring to throughout this series, and find that it's a really great example of how we look at the multiple soil properties to ensure that we have a viable and thriving production system. We've already talked about the physical and chemical properties of the soil. We've touched a little bit on root health in previous videos. And so now we're going to focus more on soil organic matter, active carbon, and mineralizable nitrogen, and some practices that we might use to enhance soil fertility. So whenever we start thinking about soil fertility and soil health, we have to think about soil biology. And by all means, soil biology is such an important part of the farming system in organic agriculture. And we are just beginning to understand and appreciate all of the different types of organisms that are in the soil and what their roles are. The soil is truly a living space that is home to billions of microorganisms even within a handful of soil. So we need to appreciate that and manage for that. So what does this soil biology want? In an earlier presentation, I talked about what plants want, and now we're talking about biology and mainly the soil organisms. Generally speaking, they are living below ground, and so they are looking for a dark environment. They're not adapted to sunlight. They all need adequate temperature ranges to survive in, as well as adequate moisture, oxygen, pH, and they also need a source of food, or if they can't gather the food and eat it themselves, they need a host that will provide it to them, and perhaps even some surplus nutrients that might be floating around in the soil solution. They also want to live in a friendly community of other organisms and have a protected space so that they're not being eaten by predators or exposed to environmental stressors. And lastly, they might be interested in a lower disturbance soil condition. Let's take a quick look at lower disturbance as an example. And Dr. Derek Lynch and his graduate student, Karen Nelson, had done research on earthworm populations in cropping systems. And in these two graphs, the graph on the left, it shows the numbers of individuals of earthworms, and showing it the data for 2 years, so that's the two different lines. And the first year was the potato year, and then they counted the number of years after that and continued to monitor earthworm populations and their recovery. So the first graph on the left is the number of earthworms, the one on the right is biomass of earthworms. So largely what you see here is that potato event is a very extreme soil disturbance event that damages a lot of organisms below ground, is extremely disruptive to the soil in the management and harvesting processes, and essentially it reduces the numbers of earthworms very quickly. And it takes time for that population to recover. You can see that it takes at least 3 years and perhaps even 4 to 5 years before the earthworm population returns back to pre-disturbance conditions. So that's just one indicator of soil health that we commonly are looking at these days when with earthworms, if you can actually get out in the field and take those samples. But there's also a soil health testing lab in Prince Edward Island, or the soil testing lab in PEI does a soil health lab analysis as well. And it doesn't do the full Cornell framework of soil health assessment, but it focuses only on a few properties. These properties are soil respiration, aggregate stability, which we talked about in a previous presentation, active carbon, biological nitrogen availability, and soil texture, which we also talked about in a previous session. So today we're going to focus more on respiration, active carbon, and biological nitrogen availability. Most soil health analyses will also consider the soil extractable nutrient contents that are present on a normal soil test, and would also include soil pH and organic matter contents. So let's take a look at some of these factors a little bit more closely. And first, I'd like to talk about organic matter, and its quantity and quality is so very closely linked with the soil biological activity and nutrient turnover. So let's take a look. When we think about organic matter, this is the dead and decomposing materials of previously living plants, microorganisms, insects, animals that all died and ultimately ended up in the soil. Soil organic matter equals 1.72 times the percent carbon in the soil. So if you wanted to do a conversion, that would be the conversion factor there. Soil organic matter is extremely important because it helps to improve soil tilth, it holds water and nutrients, it provides nutrients and food for soil life. It also improves soil structure, including water infiltration, airflow, rooting, and erosion resistance. Organic matter consists of 4 different components. The living organisms, which make up less than 5% of the total organic matter in the soil. And then we have the fresh residues, so that's the material that's just dropped off of leaves and roots that have just died, that are fresh and readily available to microorganisms to eat. Then we have what's called the active organic matter, and this is fairly new organic matter that's been deposited in the soil and can account for anywhere from 10 to 50% of the soil organic matter content, depending upon how the soil has been managed over time. And then lastly, we have stable organic matter, which accounts for 30 to 50% of the organic matter content. And it's important to consider these different organic matter types because they influence different soil properties. Typically, the Cornell Soil Health Framework will look at organic matter, and it has separate curves drawn for different soil textures. So, but overall, we could indicate that a target of around 3.5% soil organic matter content is a good target for a healthy functioning soil as a minimum, and we could then go up from there. When we look a little bit more closely at soil organic matter content, and we talked a little bit about the passive and or stable component and then active components. Here you can see that the pie has been split up a little bit differently because there can be such variability in organic, the different types of organic matter. But you have the active, the slow, and the passive organic matter. The active organic matter component includes the active carbon and soil protein content, and it's a key driver of respiration in the soil. When we look at all of these different forms of organic matter, that makes up the total organic matter content that you see on your routine soil test. And that's measured by basically burning the soil and measuring how much carbon is released. So these different pools of organic matter are really important because the really stable pool of organic matter isn't really good for feeding the soil biology. It's great for enhancing soil till characteristics and improving cation exchange capacity and perhaps even helping with soil structure. But it doesn't really feed the soil biology and accelerate nutrient turnover nearly as much as the active carbon pool does. And within that fresh organic matter content, you tend to have more nitrogen-rich materials that have higher protein contents, and that combined with the active carbon pool really is what's feeding the soil biology. The biology needs the organisms in the soil that are decomposing plant material. They are eating carbon residues, and they need to have protein sources as well as a nitrogen source. And the combined decomposition is what creates an active and living soil biology. And we can measure that, how active that biology is, by measuring the respiration rates from the soil. So how much CO2 or carbon dioxide is being emitted from the soil. So the more active carbon you have in the soil combined with more soil protein, so nitrogen, leads to higher respiration rates in the soil. So when we look at the Canadian organic standards, we can see that there's in the general principles and management standards that are practices relating to soil fertility and nutrient management should be oriented around increasing soil organic matter. That is one of the key practices, and we want to use that organic matter enhancement to promote a balance of nutrients and also to stimulate soil biological activity. And if we take a look at just some of the basic practices that we can adopt when we're improving our soil fertility, we really need to start from the beginning and make sure that we're selecting a good site and preparing it properly, identifying its fertility status with soil tests, and developing a good nutrient management plan and also a soil biology management plan that will stimulate that soil and activate that nutrient cycling. And some of the practices include adding organic matter to the soil, but also strategic cultivation, timing to warm the soil, incorporate amendments, and minimize soil degradation. So tillage can be used very strategically to enhance that nutrient cycling. However, there are also systems where you might minimize your amount of tillage. That slows nutrient cycling, but over time you could have a greater buildup of organic matter. When we think about the mineralization of organic matter, or how nutrients become available, they go through a process of decomposition. And the conversion of nutrients from an organic molecule form to a mineral nutrient form is really important. So when nutrients are part of living tissue, they are part of complex molecules such as protein, which is a big long chain of a molecule. So nitrogen would be part of a protein molecule. And that would be because there's carbon in these chains of molecules, those are regarded as organic forms of molecules in chemistry. And it takes time for soil biology to break down those materials. Plants themselves cannot use the nutrients that are already still part of other tissue that's that hasn't been decomposed yet. So it's important that you go through this decomposition process that's called mineralization. So it converts the nutrients that are in an organic form to a mineral form. And that converts the nutrients to a form that plants or crops can actually use. And soil biology is critical for that process. But we'll also talk about how the quality of the organic matter can have a big influence on the turnover or nutrient cycling that can ultimately feed your next crop as well. So let's take a look at the quality of food for different organisms and or different types of plant materials and how they might affect nutrient turnover. So generally speaking, we want to have a higher nitrogen content to accelerate decomposition rates if you want to feed the soil biology. But if you want to build long-term soil organic matter into humus, then you might have a lower nitrogen content and a high carbon content. So what we do is we look at a carbon to nitrogen ratio, and you can probably surmise that materials such as sawdust, they aren't very digestible to the soil biology. It's fairly hard for them to eat that material. And it tends to have a really high amount of carbon, such as 400 parts of carbon to only 1 part of nitrogen. So why is this important? Well, soil biology, soil organisms typically need a balanced diet of carbon and nitrogen. They're usually looking for a balance of around 20:1 to 25:1. And so if we go down the list past straw residue, which is 70:1, leaves from autumn from trees would also quite high. Corn stalks are 60:1. Eventually we get down to fresh ryegrass, and you see that fresh grass would be around 25:1. When you get to legumes, you can see that the carbon to nitrogen ratio actually gets even lower, and it might be 15 to 20 to 1 part nitrogen. So adding residues that have a low carbon content relative to nitrogen is much more desirable for the soil biology, and they will tend to consume that much more quickly, and you'll have higher respiration rates. So in other words, you have biological stimulation happening. So if you're trying to stimulate the turnover of nutrients, you want to be adding materials to the soil that have a high active organic matter content and high protein content, so high nitrogen content. And that would be in this group here that I've highlighted with this bar. Now, when we compost these materials, we tend to stabilize the nitrogen and the carbon, so it becomes a little less available, but it does maintain high phosphorus availability, so that's fairly good. But compost is a great amendment to enhance many soil quality characteristics. When we look at the plant residues and their biological nitrogen availability, it essentially is evaluating what is the, as I mentioned, the ratio of carbon to nitrogen in the plant material. And this really depends upon how fresh the plant material is. If it's really well decomposed, then if it's really old plant material, then it might contain really high amounts of carbon and lignins and fats and waxes and so on, and it might not be easy to decompose. But if it's young and fresh, it tends to have a higher protein content and perhaps higher sugar and starch content. And that is really desirable for soil biology, and that stimulates very rapid turnover. So if we're trying to stimulate nutrient turnover in the soil, we're looking for young and fresh plant material that has a higher protein content and perhaps some sugars and starches as well. So as you might have gathered by now, the decomposition of organic matter actually takes some time. You don't get an immediate or instantaneous nutrient release when you incorporate a soil amendment. And so let's take a look at this process. So if we have this graph is showing the daily nitrogen supply or crop nitrogen uptake. So the crop nitrogen uptake is illustrated by the line, which is orange in this case, and the daily nitrogen supply is indicated in purple. So over time, as the soil warms up in the spring, gradually the soil biology will become more and more active, and you'll have the organic matter will decompose and nutrients will become mineralized, and so they gradually become available through the spring and early summer. and then gradually decline in a natural soil later in the season. Now, many of our crops have much higher nitrogen demands than what the soil can supply in the background. And that all depends upon how fertile the soil is and how much active organic matter you have that's cycling. And the curve for crop uptake could really vary depending upon what kind of crop you're growing. So the trick in organic agriculture is trying to figure out how we enhance the background supply of soil nitrogen so that there's natural cycles that actually provide enough nutrients to support crop uptake throughout the growing season. And how do we do that? If you're a conventional farmer, you might be applying split applications of a nitrogen fertilizer. So you might supplement the background soil fertility with fertilizers applied in the spring, and then you might give it a little boost of nitrogen later in the season as well to make sure that you're meeting crop requirements. In organic systems, we generally don't have soil amendments that have that level of high nutrient availability and can't really be used in the same way. So how do we actually enhance soil fertility in organic systems? We need to enhance it by enhancing biological activity using crop rotations. And this means most typically that we're using crops that match our nutrient supply in the soil, but we also use crops like annual green manures and perennial forages that are plowed under or incorporated to supply nitrogen. So the green manures are most often legumes that can fix nitrogen. And some of these, it's a really nice picture here of a nodule that's that's actively taking nitrogen into the nodule and which is feeding these leguminous plants. So if you have legumes like a pea crop or a soybean, they generally can fix most of the nitrogen that they need to grow. However, grassy crops like wheat and oats and barley, they can't fix their own nitrogen, and so they rely on other sources. Now, green manure crops typically are legumes because they can fix their own nitrogen, and when you plow them under, they will add that nitrogen into the soil. And you can see that they actually fix a lot of nitrogen in the order of 100 to 200 kilograms per hectare, depending upon the type of crop. There are many different common green manure options, field peas, lentils, perhaps not quite as common as a plow down. Then you have fava bean, alfalfa, red clover, mixed crops of peas, oats, and barley, hairy vetch, and chickling vetch. All except for the grasses in this mixed crop are common green manures and legumes. So they will fix their own nitrogen and supply it in the soil. So by growing a green manure crop, you would grow it before your cash crop is being grown. You would incorporate that green manure crop, or perhaps you're going to use the Rodale roller crimper to terminate the green manure without tillage. That's a possibility as well. But bottom line is that you will terminate the green manure crop, and it still requires decomposition of that organic matter in order to release the nutrients to your crop. But you can see that you can dramatically supplement the amount of nitrogen that's being supplied to the crop above and beyond the soil background nutrient supply. But you still might be short of nutrients, and so you might be looking for other sources of nutrients, and this is when you start relying on other soil amendments. So you might use compost or manure or other waste byproducts such as fish waste. You might also supplement with mineral nutrients and microbial inoculants, and perhaps even use biological stimulants to enhance rooting and nutrient uptake. Whenever looking for soil amendments, you must make sure that you are meeting the Canadian Organic Standards requirements and looking at the permitted substances list to make sure that you're not in violation of the standards. You can also look at the directory of brand name inputs that are allowed in organic agriculture, and the Organic Federation of Canada has a nice page that links you to different brand name inputs. When you're applying compost, sometimes compost is harder to come by and can be a little bit costly, and there can be different strategies as to how you use it. You might use it by spreading it on the soil surface and incorporating it in a shallow way. This kind of spreads the compost out and you get a wider benefit, but the benefit might not be as intense. You also might, if you have beds that you're planting, or perhaps bush fruits such as haskap, or haskap would be a great example, or currants, you might put your compost down in a trench format, so you're concentrating the nutrients in a smaller area but deeper into the soil. And that might encourage your roots to go down deeper and might improve soil properties deeper into the soil as well. There's other forms of soil amendments such as feather meals, alfalfa meal, poultry manure compost, and vermicastings that can also help to provide supplemental nutrients. Crab meal is another one that's available in our region. Some of these amendments supply nutrients fairly slowly, and perhaps only 50% of the nutrient is available in the first year. Vermicastings have a pretty good flush of nutrients quickly, and then it doesn't last too long. Feather meal has a higher concentration of nutrients. It's not always easily available though. And the poultry manure tends to provide maybe 40 to 50% of the rated nitrogen content in the first year. Applying materials such as wood shavings can add some organic matter to the soil. In this case, the wood shavings were being used in part to help with weed control around the base of haskap plants. But what can happen when you're using sawdust or wood shavings is that the high carbon content of the material might actually tie up or immobilize nutrients, at least for a while, until the wood shavings have decomposed. And the impact of this will kind of depend upon the level of background soil fertility that you have. If you have a really high organic matter, active organic matter content, and really good nitrogen cycling happening in the soil, then you may not see as much of an impact from the carbon addition. But if you have a lower fertility soil, you might actually see the carbon, at least for a period of time, tying up the nutrients, and you could see deficiencies in your crops. There's lots of other soil amendments that are out there that are available for you to use. I always encourage that everyone try this on their own operation, but make sure that the products are listed as appropriate or permitted in organic farming systems. And lastly, I have mycorrhizal inoculants here, and I find mycorrhizal fungi are so valuable in terms of enhancing the rooting system of plants for mycorrhizal plants. Don't have time to get into that in detail today, but you can see the really nice fine fibers of the fungi that will will essentially expand the root system of the crop. So not all organic fertilizers are okay to be used on organic farms. Some fertilizer materials will say they are organic, and they are talking about it from a molecular form. So they're not a mineral fertilizer, they are organic molecules. But that does not always mean that they are permitted to be used on organic farming operations. So please make sure that that they are approved for use on certified organic operations before you apply it. So as we wrap up this discussion about soil fertility and nutrient management, I just want to come back to our sustainable soil management system here. We need, to become sustainable soil managers, we need to understand our basic soil characteristics and what they are, address those fundamental soil properties of soil physical and chemical properties, and then we can manage the soil biology through organic amendments and residue and cover crops, and to ultimately have a really healthy, well-functioning soil that will support our crops and hopefully contribute to all of society. So I have lots of resources available here for you to look at, and you can pause and take a look at these resources, and otherwise they should be available on the website as well. So with that, that's the end of my discussion about soil fertility. I hope that was helpful to you. You can sign up for our free Organic Agriculture Centre of Canada newsletter on our website at www.dal.ca/OACC, and sign up for our Twitter feed at Organic Ag Canada. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to chatting with you all.